Good morning, everyone. I am Rebecca Vickers, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Risk and Protective Factor Theory, Understanding Root Causes of Substance Use Disorders with Susie Kowalski. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children, Families, Office of Substance Abuse, Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located in the lower right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options will be posted in the chat panel as well. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and use the call-in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADAA website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoint, go to our website at www.fada.org and then to our Resource Center and then to our training library. FADAA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credits for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, your web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation on FADAA's website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADAA as a part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Please note that the evaluation will close midnight, Monday, January 31st. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. Susie Kowalski has been serving stigmatized communities for more than a decade through direct clinical practice as well as by delivering training and consultation to students, service providers, and administrators. Susie has worked in community mental health organizations in Chicago to develop and implement new programs, combining her clinical expertise with administrative and organizational skills to launch trauma-informed programs based on principles of harm reduction. Susie applies her experience as an outreach worker, substance use counselor, trauma therapist, clinical supervisor, and program manager to develop trainings for a broad range of workers with different roles, experiences, and expertise. As a therapist, clinical supervisor, trainer, and consultant, Susie emphasizes a rational approach in which healthy connections facilitate the development of insight, practice of new skills, and curiosity for continued growth. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Susie Kowalski. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the warm introduction and for you and the rest of your team's work to bring this presentation to life this morning. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I appreciate that. And I also want to thank FADAA and the Florida Department of Children and Families for sponsoring today's presentation. It's always a pleasure working with you all. So here is my contact information. As Rebecca said, my name is Susie Kowalski, and my husband James and I operate a small business called Practice for Progress. And that's really a nod to our roots in harm reduction and trauma-informed care. So we live and work in Chicago, where we offer training and consultation and supervision. But today, I'm really excited to be joining you all from Florida. This is my first time doing a FADAA webinar from the state of Florida. We drove down to escape the cold for a little bit. So we're here for just a couple more days. So I'm coming to you from Hollywood, Florida. So if you have any recommendations of places to check out in our last few days here, feel free to enter them into the chat. I've already heard that we've got to check out the wings at Ricky's. But anyway, just wanted to let you know I'm here with you in Florida. And here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out after today's session if you have any lingering questions or are looking for a particular resource. I'm always happy to hear from folks and to be a resource to you all. There are no actual or potential conflicts of interest to disclose, and this presentation was created without any commercial support. Here is our roadmap for today, and so we will start out in our time this morning. We'll talk through some key features of both risk and protective factors, and we'll explore them across multiple contexts, which is going to be a really important piece of our understanding. We'll talk through some common risk and protective factors, and specifically what you tend to see in the communities and people you serve. And we'll talk about their potential to influence individuals' relationships with drugs. And then we will wrap up by reviewing SAMHSA's strategic prevention framework, which offers a really nice structure for integrating our understanding of risk and protective factors into prevention efforts and approaches and programs. So as we begin to dive in this morning, I want to start by asking you to consider, when you think about the people you've worked with, what kind of factors have influenced the paths that people end up taking? I'm sure that we've all had experiences where we've worked with two people who may have had some similar life experiences, but they ended up going in really different directions. And I know that when that's happened in my work, I can't help but wonder why. Why did two people who experienced a similar kind of adversity end up in really different places? Or when something really positive has happened, why did it make such a big difference for one person but not another? So I'd encourage you to think about times when you've seen that happen in your own caseload or your own circle of friends or family or within a community, and to think about what was the difference that made a difference. And that's kind of what leads us to thinking about risk and protective factors. So throughout our time here today, we'll be really talking through SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework Guide, and it's linked here and it's definitely in the resources, and we'll be using this as our outline. And they spend a lot of time in this guide really detailing key features of risk and protective factors and the ways that they can be influential in prevention efforts. SAMHSA offers us these key features, these 4 features, which we'll look through much more closely. We know that risk and protective factors exist in multiple contexts. They're also correlated and cumulative. We know that individual factors, meaning an individual risk or protective factor, can be associated with multiple problems. and that risk and protective factors are influential over time. They don't have just a short impact. It's also really important to recognize here that the underlying factors that drive a substance misuse problem in one community will likely be pretty different from the factors that drive that same problem in a different community because of these key features. So effective prevention efforts really focus on reducing the risk factors and strengthening the protective factors that are specific to the priority problems of any given community. So the first feature is that we know that these risk and protective factors exist in multiple contexts. And what that means is that every one of us has characteristics, whether they're biological or psychological, that make us more vulnerable or resilient in response to potential behavioral health issues. But we aren't islands and we don't exist in isolation. And so our risk and protective factors are also influenced by the relationships that we have. They're influenced by the communities that we live in and by the larger societies that we belong to. And so those factors also influence each other. So there's a lot of different interactions that occur here. So this is I think, helpful visual for trying to understand all these overlapping Venn diagrams. We tend to focus a lot on individual risk and protective factors, but targeting our prevention as well as our treatment efforts at the individual level isn't as likely to be successful because people don't live in isolation. So we need to consider their context in pretty nuanced ways. So an individual could have a family history of substance use disorder, which we know will be an individual risk factor. But we also want to think about, what do we know about that person's living environment? What are their family and social relationships like? What kind of community resources are available to this individual? And thinking more broadly, what type of societal factors influence this person's access to those resources? And then how do these various considerations loop back around to impact that individual? We also know that some of these factors are fixed, meaning they stay the same. So things like someone's personal or family history, those aren't things that necessarily change over time. But other factors like the quality of someone's interpersonal connections or their employment status, those things are variable. They change over time, and those changes also have ripple effects of their own. So we know that there are a lot of different individual risk factors, and looking a little more closely at these individual factors, some of the more common ones we tend to see include things like physical health conditions are an individual risk factor, but we also know that this is really clearly and closely related to other contexts. So something we've been all watching unfold over the past nearly 2 years is how an individual's physical health is impacted by their context. We're seeing this with COVID-19. So some individuals have conditions that put them at increased risk, but do they have paid time off work? Do they have affordable childcare? Do they have health insurance? And can they or do they access preventative medical care? So this is just an example of some of the ways that we see how these individual risk factors are really influenced by the other contextual factors that surround an individual. Some of the really key risk factors that we see at the individual level are the person's personal and family history of substance use disorder, mental health conditions, and or experiences of trauma. When we know that that's the case, we also want to know things like, when did that start? Someone who starts having a difficult relationship with substances at the age of 14, that might be a little bit different in terms of their risk and preventative factors versus someone who started having signs of substance use disorder when they're 44. So we want to know, when did these things begin? And then also, how did they respond to treatment? Did this person have access to treatment? Were they open to it? And what was their experience and response when they did access treatment? Again, we also want to consider their family history. Is there an intergenerational history and transmission? We see that quite a bit with trauma, but also with substance use disorder and mental health conditions, because we also know that those three are so closely linked. We know that being socially isolated is a risk factor, which is an individual risk factor, but again, it's kind of a nod to a relationship risk factor. And then what is this person's level of stress? Something that for most of us tends to be pretty variable, so something that changes quite a bit, but what's their current level of stress? What's their socioeconomic status? And what's their belief system? Having a sense of meaning and purpose can be a significant protective factor, and so of course the absence of it would present as a risk factor. An interesting individual factor is age, which in itself can be a risk factor, but it's something that is definitely variable and obviously changes over time, but has really significant implications in terms of the interaction between individual risk factors and those other contextual factors that we've been discussing. So, for example, during adolescence and young adulthood, peer pressure is likely to be a much more significant risk factor for substance use disorder than it would be later in adulthood. We also know that in adolescence and early adulthood, social relationships tend to be more unstable as well as more influential, which has some pretty big implications in terms of someone's risk for substance use disorder. So I would love to hear from you all. If you think about some of the people that you serve, what sorts of protective factors do you observe in the people that you've worked with? And things to maybe consider or think through are, are these individual factors fixed or variable, and how do they interact with these other contextual factors? So if folks can go ahead and enter into the chat some of the individual level protective factors that you have seen in people you all work with. Yeah, so having a clear sense of purpose, environmental support, right? Spirituality and family support. I'm seeing a lot here in terms of people's belief systems being a really significant protective factor. A lot of mention of spirituality, religious beliefs, purpose, faith, religion, having a healthy family system, family support, absolutely. So, and some of these things you're mentioning are fixed and some are variable. Economically stable, absolutely. So I like the way that you all are identifying some of these things, and I think this is also a helpful exercise when we think about some of the people that we work with. Compassion and acceptance, I like that. To think about what types of, and to kind of train ourselves to be able to identify in the people that we serve some of their protective factors. I think sometimes people's risk factors become more evident to us and they jump out and they're maybe a little bit louder. But it's a helpful and important exercise, I think, for us to also be in the habit of thinking about what are some of the protective factors that we see. And I also noticed that in your responses, you all are naming a lot of the ways that these individual factors are really related to especially relationship factors in terms of family support and relationships with family and their support system, but also thinking at the community level as well. Thank you all. So let's move on to relationship risk factors. We see here parental divorce or separation from a caregiver. That's something that we definitely know can present an increased risk for substance use disorder, especially if it occurs during childhood or adolescence, more so than happening later in adulthood. We can understand that like your parents getting divorced when you're 8 is really different than your parents getting divorced when you're 38. It's not to say that it's insignificant, but the impact that that would have for someone is quite different based on their age. We also know that social influences and familial influences are often present simultaneously, especially during adolescence and young adulthood, where we know that people are really more outwardly focused and they still live at home and have a lot of family contact and family influence, but their peers and their peer groups have such a significant role as well. And that interaction creates a really complex system of risk factors that predicts a lot of adolescent substance use, which is really important for us to take into consideration. So similarly, we know that peer pressure and someone's perception of their own popularity or social standing have been shown to be associated with increased risk for adolescent substance use. So when an adolescent believes that their popularity within a peer group increases when they're using substances, they're more likely to participate in substance use because we know that those social influences are so important at that age. What is interesting that I want to layer on here is the impact of a community and community values and beliefs. So I was thinking about a time when I worked with a lot of teenagers in a particular community, and this community was really highly educated. There were high aspirations and expectations of these teens. And one of the things that they talked about was how in their school, in their peer group, smoking was really not seen as cool. They said like no one really smokes or even vapes because people are educated about the risks, and you know, doing harm to your body isn't seen as like a cool way to rebel. And so these teens are telling me like really no one smokes and vapes and there's not peer pressure to do it. And the people who do are sort of labeled as being like dumb or not very smart, and they're really looked down upon. I thought that was really interesting because I know I've worked in a lot of other communities where adolescents smoke as a way to seem more mature or cool. And so it's an interesting way for us to think about the ways that community values can really influence people's relationship risk factors for substance use disorder. So similarly, I'm going to ask you all to think through some of the people you've worked with and to identify and enter into the chat what type of relationship protective factors do you observe in the people that you've worked with? And again, to think about, are these things that are fixed, meaning they stay the same, or do they change over time? And how might they interact with other contextual factors? So take a minute to think about it and go ahead and enter your responses into the chat. Yeah, Angela's mentioning positive peer influences, consistency and communication with others, positive, healthy friendships, strong parental support. That one is huge. Being influenced in positive ways by partners, I like this one, devoted to the happiness of the family and spouse, supportive relationships. Yeah, some relationships can be more stable, some are more variable. I am, Josie's mentioning having a sense of understanding and availability from your support system. Communication, absolutely. I like this. The recovery network of support, don't do this solo. Having a good mentor figure, positive school climate, yeah, strong relationships within a faith community. So thank you all so much for these. These are amazing to hear about, and I'm sure really important to notice and observe in the communities that you serve. But we know that these relational protective factors can be so impactful in really mitigating the impact of some of the individual or even community risk factors, right? When people live in situations where they might experience a lot of risk factors in other ways, having those strong, healthy friendships, having good role models, having positive relationships with friends and family can go such a long way with people. So we want to make sure to really assess for and identify the relational protective factors, not to say that any of these are more important than others, and at the same time, we are relational beings, and so having those strong protective relationships can really go a long way in mitigating risk. So moving on to the community level, one of the metaphors that I often think about, which is very Florida appropriate, is that sometimes we work with individuals whose households are kind of like a brick house in a hurricane. So within their walls, they have a lot of individual and relational protective factors. They have loving families where there's an emphasis on healthy connection and significant efforts and values toward health in a variety of ways. But at the same time, they may live in communities where there's widespread poverty, where there's really high rates of substance use. I worked on the west side of Chicago, which is sort of an open-air drug market, and you can witness people engaging in substance use on every block. That's going to present as a significant risk factor. Areas where there's a lot of community violence, where the people who live there live with a lot of fear of discrimination. And in general, just having a lack of resources within a community presents so many risk factors. When people don't have access to affordable, safe, and stable housing, that's absolutely going to impact their risk for substance use disorder. Someone's employment status and their ability to gain employment. What is the access like in this area for medical care or treatment? How are the schools? What's the quality of education that's available to young people? Is this community a food desert where it's really hard to have, a store that even has fresh and healthy food? Transportation isn't on here, but that's the big one. Is there a way to get to a place that has, fresh and healthy food? And what kind of recreational activities are available? How do people have fun in ways that aren't centered around substance use, and in ways that really support that healthy development of joy? I know in certain neighborhoods, there may be parks, but it doesn't feel safe for people to go and play at them. So what are young people supposed to do in order to connect with each other, but also to experience their sense of recreation? So these are significant things that we want to pay attention to, because it's a lot of the setting where those other risk and protective factors unfold. So again, I'm going to ask you all to think about the communities that you serve and the communities that the people you work with live in, And what kind of protective factors do you notice? And once again, to think through, are those protective factors things that are pretty fixed or variable? And how might they interact with the other contextual factors we've been discussing? So take a moment to think through that. And when you're ready, go ahead and enter some of your responses into the chat. Yeah, transportation is a big one, especially here in South Florida, being able to travel, things are a little more spread out. Strong social welfare and education, influence again of the church and faith community, outreach programs. As a former outreach worker, I appreciate that. Stable housing and employment, mental health unit at the sheriff's department to address comorbidity, food pantries, community centers. That's awesome. That gives kids a safe place to go. Youth programs, positive influence in school clubs. Libraries are a huge one. Housing stability, mobile health care, again, kind of a nod to the outreach workers. This is great. And adult drop-in centers, we forget about sometimes those needs. And I'm seeing some things listed that I think also speak to some of the society protective factors. So funding for things like emergency housing or basic needs assistance, cultural connections. I love seeing that. So thank you all so much. These are really amazing resources to know about, and also to think about how do these things work as protective factors, and how can we shape our prevention programs to really highlight and leverage these amazing community resources that are out there and available for folks. Thank you all so much for these suggestions. I love hearing about what's happening in your communities here. So moving on to our last factor is looking at the society level. What kinds of risk factors do we have? So certainly the stigmatization of substance use and people with substance use disorders can present a significant risk factor, right? What are our beliefs about people's substance use and their treatment needs? And I think, thinking at a variable level, it's important to consider how do our beliefs change depending on who those people are, depending who's using substances and what substances they're using. Do we view this as a criminal legal issue or a public health issue? And how do we respond and fund and support those efforts? Beliefs about treatment in general. We know that institutional racism and oppression are kind of baked into a lot of our legal structures around substance use, and we continue to see the effects of that today. So that's something that we also want to really consider when we think about those community and even, filtering that down to the individual level, how the influence can really still be seen there. I've talked a good amount about the accessibility of community resources and support. Their presence is the amount to which certain people, and who are those people, can access those resources is really influenced by some of these bigger picture society factors. And then I think there's an important question of what is the balance and the pervading view on what sorts of things fall under individual responsibility and what level of support is appropriate or needed at the society level, and kind of how does that all shake out? So, yes, absolutely. Dee is asking about long wait times to enter services. That is, I would say, both a community and society risk factor that we need to think about, because to some degree, there's, some community-based things of like what is available in the community, but at the society level, how long it takes to enter services is also related to things like how do we fund it and what are people's views on treatment and what appropriate treatment looks like. So I'm going to ask you all to identify some society level protective factors that you see in the people, communities, and societies that you serve. So go ahead and think through that, and when you're ready, enter some of your responses into the chat, please. So insurance, huge one. Staff in school systems being more educated. We're hearing a lot more about trauma-informed schools. The destigmatization of mental illness is a huge thing that hopefully we're making some traction on. Emelina's mentioning harm reduction programs, which I'm always happy to see as a huge champion of harm reduction, access to good health care, program availability and cost, long waiting lists for services. So the protective factor would be short waiting lists for services, inclusion, a lot of emphasis on stigma, aftercare programs. I like seeing Big Brother, Big Sister programs, pulling in some of those peer support services, some different mutual respect, aid and support groups to destigmatize mental health and substance use issues. That is huge. Kalisha's mentioning that the pandemic has really helped to promote more acceptance and access to mental health care. It's something that we know affects all of us. Good communication between agencies, that's huge. It goes such a long way. So thank you all. I think that thinking at the society level also certainly helps us identify some protective factors, but can also help us understand where we may need to target some of our preventative efforts as well. So, believe it or not, this has actually all been just part of key feature number 1, that our risk and protective factors exist in multiple contexts. So, thank you for your contributions to really unfolding and unpacking what some of these things are, those different contexts and what that looks like. So the second key feature of risk and protective factors is that they're correlated and cumulative. And what that means is that people with some risk factors tend to have an increased chance of experiencing more risk factors and are less likely to have robust protective factors. Some people who have some protection, meaning some protective factors, generally are more likely to have more protective factors and less risk. So we see this correlation. We also know that risk and protective factors really add up over the lifetime. So young people who have multiple risk factors are at increased risk, and people who have multiple protective factors are at a reduced risk. So this is kind of the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? An individual could have a couple risk factors here and there, but their overall risk tends to really accumulate. So this helps us understand where prevention efforts really need to target multiple factors rather than single ones because of the ways that risk and protective factors tend to be correlated and cumulative. So I like this quote. This kind of brings us to the ACEs study, which refers to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And we'll watch a video about it in just a moment. But I like this quote that adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. So we're going to watch a video that kind of provides some background information about the ACEs so we can all know about it, and then we'll spend some time really unpacking it. So Rebecca and Eric, whenever you're ready, I'll turn it over to you for the video. right, thank you all for watching that. So I included a slide here that lists the 10 ACEs, and they divide them into these three categories. And so I wanted to include this mainly for reference so that you have it all in one place, but also as you look at this list of these 10 childhood adversities, I'd encourage you to think about some of the people you've worked with and to look through and think about what was their ACE score. So when I worked in substance use treatment on the west side of Chicago, which is really the city's like ground zero for the overdose crisis, just about everyone who walked through our doors had an ACE score of at least 6, but many of the people we served had ACE scores more like in the 8, 9, 10 range. So we know from the ACE score, from the ACE study, that ACEs are both correlated and cumulative, much like risk and protective factors. So they're correlated in that they cluster. Having one ACE really increased the chances of having more. So of the people who had one ACE, 87% of them had 2 or more. And we see that about 12.5% of this population had 4 or more ACEs, and 4 kind of seems to be the number at which we see pretty significant changes. So that speaks to the accumulation. Higher ACE scores really increase people's risk for multiple problems. So we saw in the video that people with 4 or more ACEs are at increased risk for violence, divorce, broken bones, drug prescriptions, and that's not saying drug problems, but just to be prescribed drugs, depression, autoimmune diseases. So we see the impact of these ACEs in a lot of different areas. And it's pretty startling to know that having 6 or more ACEs on average really shortened people's lifespan by 20 years. So it's a really significant thing for us to know. So we see that the ACEs accumulate in terms of their impact, and the higher ACE score a person has, the greater the risk for having a really wide range of problems later in life. So we see from the ACE study that just some more statistics here. Like I said, that 4 and more ACEs was the kind of number at which we see pretty significantly increased risk. And I think what's interesting is to know is that at the population level, it didn't matter which 4 ACEs a person has. So it's not saying that these 4 ACEs are more harmful than others. The harmful consequences are the same. And so we see here that in terms of mental health, people with 4 or more ACEs were at 13 times of an increased risk for making a suicide attempt. They had 7 times the risk of alcohol use disorder and 10 times the risk of intravenous drug use. And I think it's really staggering to know that for men in particular, having 6 or more ACEs put them at 46 times the risk of IV drug use. So it's really staggering to consider that these 10 factors can be correlated with so many different issues and in such a dramatic way. We also see then that one of the other big findings from the ACE study is that childhood adversity really contributes to a lot of our major chronic health, mental health, economic health, and social health issues. So they're very big in their impact. And at the same time, it's important to know and remember that these 10 adverse childhood experiences don't exist in isolation. ACEs really parallel the key features of risk and protective factors that we looked at way back on one of the very first slides. So the risk and protective factors for ACEs, like risk and protective factors for individuals for substance use disorder, exist in these multiple contexts of the individual level, relationship level, community, and society. ACEs, like risk and protective factors, are correlated and cumulative. An individual ACE can be associated with multiple problems, and ACEs are influential over time. We absolutely see them being passed down across generations. So this pyramid is one of the ways that shows how this happens. So the ACE study demonstrated that there's a clear correlation between early adversity and a pretty broad range of problems later in life. And so this is kind of the way for us to understand, like, how does that happen? So I like that this pyramid at the bottom really begins with an acknowledgement of intergenerational trauma and the fact that growing up in a family where your caregivers had high ACE scores dramatically increases an individual's chances of having a high ACE score themselves, right? ACEs don't just happen out of nowhere. The stage is really set for them to occur based on a pattern of intergenerational and historical trauma, in addition to the social conditions and local context in which an individual grows up. Moving on from there, in the past 20 years, we've learned so much more about how experiencing early adversities can impact someone's neurodevelopment and actually change the way that the brain operates, which has really significant implications in terms of an individual's social, emotional, and cognitive abilities. So if your brain and body are so focused on survival, or if connections aren't sources of healthy soothing, the good news is that we have this amazing ability to survive, and our body and brain do all these things that keep us alive, but they come at a cost. So kids who grow up in these types of environments really struggle as a direct result with things like focused attention, emotional regulation, memory, learning, understanding what healthy relationships look like and feel like. And what we often see then is that people find ways to adapt, and they do it a lot of times by engaging in risky behaviors. So things like substance use, but also things like dropping out of school or not trusting doctors or other authorities, neglecting their mental health, withdrawing from relationships because relationships haven't proven to be safe places in the past. And then we can understand where this leads to disease or disability and social problems. And then at the very top of the pyramid, unfortunately, in many instances, this leads to early death. And again, we know that those who had an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier, which is really the accumulation of all of these different things. So their deaths didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was really built on these different foundational aspects. So ACEs are a really important factor for us to know about and assess for in the people and communities we serve. So how common are they? In the original study, like the video mentioned, almost 2/3 of adults reported having at least one ACE, and the majority of people who reported at least one ACE reported more than one. So they're pretty common. And it also depends on who you are to decide how common they are. So how common ACEs are really depends on the contextual factors that surround an individual. ACEs are incredibly common throughout the population, but they are also more common and disproportionately common among certain groups that we see listed here. So they're primarily common among people who are not likely to have grown up in places with robust protective factors at the relationship level or within their communities and in a broader society as a whole. So while individuals have their own ACE score, each of us have our own ACE score, the factors that influence someone's ACE score are really more influential at the relationship, community and society levels. So individuals, especially children, are really resilient, but they don't have a lot of power to reduce their own ACE score. But the people and communities and programs and systems around them do have a lot of power and influence in determining someone's ACE score. So I really like this depiction of the three realms of ACEs. And it kind of talks about the idea of like the soil in which we're rooted and the branches on which we grow. So in this image here, the leaves on the tree really represent the symptoms of ACEs that often show up in our programs, right? These are like a lot of reasons that people end up coming through our doors and in our services. But it's important for us to think about what is the quality of the soil that this tree is rooted into. And unfortunately, very often, that soil is really steeped with things like systemic inequalities and dysfunction, which robs the tree of the nutrients it needs in order to support a thriving community. So this is where we are seeing a shift of talking not just about adverse childhood experiences, but extending that idea to adverse community experiences. So conditions that contribute to and really exacerbate the adversities that are experienced by individuals and families. And then the third realm here talks about the environment. And here they're referring to like the natural environment, not the environment in terms of the setting. So things related to the climate crisis and natural disasters, and how those also influence both the community and the community's households. So I like the expansion of adverse childhood experiences to the idea of adverse community experiences. And I think that has really significant implications in terms of thinking about risk and protective factors and how those are impacted by prevention efforts. So individual risks for substance use disorder are dramatically increased by adverse experiences at the relationship, community, and society levels. So community and society level risk factors may actually be more influential than individual protective factors. And so this website, which is linked here, is PACE's connection. And they talk about PACEs, not just ACEs. So they're referring to positive and adverse childhood experiences. And to be effective, our prevention efforts really need to target multiple contexts to increase protective factors. We can't just focus at the individual level. We really need to get upstream and think about upstream solutions. So, the ACEs study is a good demonstration of the ways that a single factor, like experiencing one of the ACEs, can be associated with multiple outcomes. And we see this on the flip side as well, that a single protective factor, like a supportive or encouraging teacher, can have positive influences in multiple areas of an individual's life. And this tells us again that prevention efforts that target a risk or a set of risk or protective factors rather than individual risk or protective factors have a greater potential to also produce positive effects in multiple areas. So again, I like this idea of PACEs, of thinking about both positive and adverse childhood experiences. So as far as our key factor number 4 that SAMHSA offers, it's that risk and protective factors are influential over time and that they continue to interact with each other over the course of a lifetime. So effective parenting is something that there's a lot of studies on, and what these studies show is that effective parenting, and again, effective, not ideal, right? It's not something we're saying families and parents have to be perfect, but being effective can really mitigate the effects of multiple risk factors over time and across multiple contexts. So these studies are showing that effective parenting can really mediate the effects of things like poverty, divorce, parental bereavement, or parental mental illness. So the more that prevention planners understand how risk and protective factors interact, the more effective they'll be in developing appropriate prevention and treatment programs and practices. So this is kind of what we've been talking about, but I put it in here for the visual learners among us. You know, we all take in information in different ways. I tend to be a very visual learner, so this is just a way for us to see how individual adversities or risks can be associated with multiple problems that have a lasting impact over time. So I like this graphic. And I see that you're asking, Monica's asking about access to the link on the last slide. And at the very end, we'll kind of go through, but yes, you'll receive the slides, and all of these are live hyperlinks that will bring you to these websites. So I think that this idea of these different realms of ACEs lines up really well with the idea of treatment versus prevention. So treatment we can think of as sort of working with the people who are already in the tree. Their branches have already grown, and like their leaves are what they are. And these are very often the people who end up in treatment at some point because their risk factors or ACE scores were higher. And so they show these different symptoms, and for one reason or another, they end up in our services. Prevention, on the other hand, really targets the context in which these individuals grow. So we can't change something as complicated as substance use problems by working with one individual at a time. As effective as we may be, and as wonderful as you all are at doing your jobs, we can't fix substance use problems one person at a time. We really need to focus on upstream solutions, and so that's where prevention comes in to prevent these problems from being widespread. And so this means that prevention is going to need to target communities and societies much more heavily than individuals. And this is because we know that people are a product of their environment. And so we need to change the environment if we want to change people, not the other way around. So we'll shift our attention here to talking about prevention strategies. So in terms of prevention, we really want to think about, you know, in a very basic way, how do we increase people's protective factors? How do we decrease their risk factors? And I think the key question then is like, who and how do we prioritize? So in terms of protective factors and prevention efforts, what protective factors do we need to implement in order to offset the risk of adverse community experiences? So I think some good questions for us to consider are, what would relational protection look like in terms of decreasing risk for ACEs? What kinds of community level changes do we need to establish and maintain to protect our at-risk groups? And what changes in our broader society would increase the level of protection that's available to all, but especially available to those whose safety in a lot of different iterations of the word is the least secure? So we're going to talk through different approaches to prevention. So there's like different levels of risk. So not all people or populations are at the same level of risk. And different levels of risk require different types of prevention programs. And prevention programs and practices are most effective when they're really well matched to the level of risk of their target population. So we want to be really specific here. These different levels of prevention approaches start with universal programs. So these are the broadest approach, which are designed to reach entire groups or populations. So universal programs might target schools or whole communities or workplaces. Selective programs and practices target individuals or groups who are at an increased risk because they have more risk factors and or fewer protective factors than the general population. And then the most specific level is indicated programs, which target the folks who show early signs of substance misuse, but who haven't been diagnosed with a substance use disorder. So these kinds of efforts include things like screening and consultation and referrals for people who encounter systems for things like accidents or arrests or injuries that might be alcohol and drug related. So again, we want to think about matching someone's level of risk to the type of program that we're going to use. So we're going to spend our last bit of time talking through SAMHSA's strategic prevention framework. But I do want to pause and ask if there have been any questions that come up. Rebecca has been really helpful in keeping track of any questions. So Rebecca, now's a great time for us to pause and see if there are questions that we could address at this time.
So we have not had many questions come in, Susie, but we've had just a lot of, statements. So if anybody would like to post a question in the chat, I'm happy to read it for Susie to respond to.
I see. How would we approach such a client? From Rochelle. Could you be more specific, Rochelle, about what type of client you're referring to? I see. So Rochelle is asking, have you ever had a case where a client experienced issues with all three areas due to the ACEs they have? And are the three areas, Rochelle, this is the challenge of a chat-based platform, but can you specify what three areas you mean?
Susie, while Michelle's working on that, someone asked, how do you address long-term impoverished clients?
So I think that is a great question. It's a lot of the people that I have worked with throughout my career, and there's not a simple answer. So how do you address people or populations who've lived in impoverished areas for a long time? I would say at multiple levels. So we need to work with the individual in front of us and really embrace a trauma-informed approach. And so I tend to straddle kind of the wall between direct clinical practice and some administrative roles, but generally I'm more of a clinician than an administrator. But I'm so appreciative and grateful to the administrators out there, because working with people who've been living in long-term poverty and communities that have been impoverished for a long time, again, isn't something we're going to change one individual at a time. We need, broad stroke systemic change to address things like that. So I think we have to apply kind of a both and approach of working with the individual and, using the saying we all love here of meeting people where they're at and understanding the context that that individual is living within, and then also having those really important administratively and policy focused individuals working to change those systems so that we can try and bring some more system level change.
And then we have another question. Is it appropriate to discuss ACE scores with the client after they've been assessed?
Yeah, so there's some really great resources out there, and we can walk through them a little bit at the end, but they're all links, and like I mentioned, you will receive the slides. Um, there are a lot of resources about how to do that appropriately, but my experience in talking with people and helping people learn about ACEs is that it feels really validating and empowering for people to understand that there are reasons that some of these things are unfolding in my life and that it's not just me, that I fit a pattern, and a lot of people who've had experiences like mine have some of the challenges like mine. So I think some more specifics of exactly how to address that conversation, I would direct you to some more specific resources. But yes, I think it's really important for people, and I'm seeing this as kind of the second half of this question, is how do you relay this information while instilling hope? I think of that quote that was mentioned in the video, that what's predictable is preventable, and understanding that although these experiences may put someone at increased risk, we also know that there are a lot of things that we can do to change course, and that, as the video said, ACEs aren't destiny, they're information. And so that's where we want to bring in and really build up someone's resources and support. Absolutely. And then I think I saw Rochelle clarified the question of, how do you work with a client who's experienced issues in terms of their physical, mental health, and substance use due to the ACEs? I would say this is most of who I've worked with in my career. And again, really relying on approaches based in trauma-informed care and harm reduction. And one of the things that I'll mention from a trauma-informed approach is that I think really empowering someone to make their own decisions. I think it can be really challenging for us as providers to see people making decisions that we wouldn't choose for ourselves. And that comes from a really good place. And sometimes it leads to us starting to be more directive and to tell people what to do. And we want to be really cautious and make sure that we are eliciting from someone and really trusting that they know themselves better than we know them, and that what's going to be successful in making changes in their lives are them making changes that they want to make and that they believe in, rather than sort of acquiescing us because we have pestered or sort of bullied them into doing what we think they should do. And so a trauma-informed approach, as well as harm reduction, really emphasizes the importance of making sure we're following someone's lead and not recreating inadvertently those same dynamics that were so prevalent in someone's initial experience of trauma. So that can look like, doing a lot of case management at the outset and helping someone identify what's most important to them. It may not be the thing that's most important to us, but that is a lot of how we build trust, is by taking someone's lead and working with them on the things that are important to them. All right. Yes, absolutely. Services absolutely need to be client-driven, and I think that is kind of the only effective type of service. People don't make long-standing, meaningful changes because someone else demands that they do. We make those changes when they become important to us. So again, I would add motivational interviewing into the mix of things that I would heavily rely on. Thank you all for these great questions. I'll leave some time at the end for any additional questions, but I wanted to just pause before we kind of jump further into our prevention approaches and give a couple moments to address any questions. So I'm going to move us back into the slides for now, but like I said, I'll leave some time at the end, so feel free to ask additional questions then. I should also mention, if you have other questions that you want to ask, feel free to enter them in the chat, and Rebecca will kindly gather them, and then we can address them at the end. And Tracy, I see that you're not sure your comments are going into the chat. At the bottom where it says to everyone, or who it's to, if you click on that, there'll be a drop-down menu, and if you post it to everyone or all panelists, then other folks will see it. We are going to go straight through today, so we're not going to take a break, but like I said, we had this little pause to address questions, and we'll have some time at the end for more. So we are going to wrap up our time here today by walking through the end part of SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework, and they have these 6 steps, and risk and protective factors are kind of baked into these 6 steps in ways that we'll see, but these 5 steps. So the first step is assessment, which is essentially determining what's the problem, what are the local prevention needs based on data. Step 2 is capacity, so that's where we build local resources and local readiness to address prevention efforts. So we're kind of asking what's available for us to work with. In the planning stage, we're asking what should we do and how should we do it. We're finding out what will work to address prevention needs and how should we do it well. Implementation is where we put the plan into action. We deliver evidence-based programs and practices as intended, and then we always wrap up with evaluation of, is our plan succeeding? And so we take a close look at the process and the outcomes of the programs and practices to see, is it working and what needs to be adjusted? In addition to those 5 steps, SAMHSA offers these guiding principles, which are intended to really underscore, kind of be an accompaniment throughout the entire process. So these guiding principles are cultural competence, which really refers to the ability of the individual or organization to understand and effectively interact with people who have different values, lifestyles, and traditions based on their distinctive heritage and social relationships. So a lot of cultural competence, I think, includes an element of humility, of trying to understand and interact effectively with people who come from a different cultural orientation than our own. And then the other guiding principle is sustainability, which refers to this process of building an adaptive and effective system that is able to achieve and maintain desired results in the long term. So we're not trying to put a Band-Aid on it. We're trying to think about big picture, long-lasting impact. So we'll go through the steps a little bit more closely now. And I took images from their guide, which is referenced at the end. So the first piece is this assessment step. And the purpose here is really to understand the local prevention needs. And we do that by looking carefully at data that we gather from a variety of sources. So we look at the problems and related behaviors. And what I like that they point out is that substance misuse problems and their harmful related behaviors are not necessarily the same. So we want to know things like what substance misuse problems, so that might be things like overdoses or alcohol poisoning, and related behaviors are occurring in the community. So the related behaviors might be things like prescription drug misuse or underage drinking. And how often are these problems and related behaviors occurring, and which ones are happening the most? So they'll talk a little bit more about really prioritizing which is the next step. So what's the prevalence of a specific problem or behavior, and how severe is it? How much of an impact? Do we notice any trends? Are there some patterns of how these things might be changing over time? And then they also talk about changeability. So how likely is it that a community is going to be able to actually modify the problem or behavior? And so part of this is assessing risk and protective factors, which we've talked quite a bit about this morning, but that's kind of, I think, helpful to see like where this fits in the big picture. So the next step is capacity. So in this step, they really build and mobilize local resources, and planners work to make sure that there's community buy-in for prevention efforts. So again, I think this speaks to that guiding principle of both sustainability and cultural competence, right? We're not doing something upon a community, we're working with community stakeholders and a broad range of diverse community stakeholders to determine what is most important to this community, what resources are available here, who's our prevention team, and how can we raise awareness with the purpose of increasing a buy-in for this effort. The third step is strategic planning, and I think there's a really strong emphasis here on the strategic part. So this is where we really increase the effectiveness of our prevention efforts by making sure that planners are targeting and implementing the most appropriate programs and strategies for their particular community. So this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all, but a really personalized and individualized plan for a searching community. So we see here that an essential part of the planning stage is really matching the problem to the solution. One of the interesting things I think that SAMHSA points out is that communities can't change substance misuse problems directly, but they can affect change by addressing the risk and protective factors that are associated with that problem. So this is kind of tying this all together, why it's so important for us to have this really nuanced understanding of these factors. So where do we begin, I think, is, a big question, because trying to address all these different risk and protective factors at all these multiple levels and contexts to address multiple problems can be really overwhelming, and no community can address all of these factors at once, and it wouldn't be effective to try. So they offer some good guidelines around how to prioritize which things will be most influential. So they talk about key drivers of a community's problems. So we'll kind of walk through them. So they have two features of key drivers, which ones are most important and which are most changeable. So in terms of the importance of a problem, they define that by, it describes how a specific risk or protective factor affects a problem. And we determine that by asking these questions. How much does this factor contribute to the priority problem? Is this particular risk or protective factor relevant to the developmental stage of our focused population, right? Do you have a lot of young people? Are you in a community with a lot of older folks? Just taking into account the developmental stage. And is this factor related to other harmful behavioral health issues? Again, we know that addressing risk and protective factors is most effective when we do it at multiple levels. So these are kind of tricky questions, and I don't expect you to have all of the answers now, but I did want to give you all a moment to think about, in your communities and in the community you serve, what would you say are the most important risk factors and what are the most important protective factors? And again, for reference, these are the questions that they're asking to guide what is most important. What's the most important risk factor? What's the most important um, protective factor. So I'll give you all a moment. I know these are big questions, but to go ahead and answer some of your responses into the chat. So for risk factors, I'm seeing housing costs and wages, poverty, housing, availability for resources. For protective factors, support, multiple community service agencies, housing costs, big deal. Strong support system, generational poverty, absolutely, which I'm sure relates to housing. Having both parents in the home, I like that one. Community resources, absolutely. So I'm going to ask for you all to write down for yourselves like your own personal list of the most important risk factors and protective factors in your community, because we're going to come back to this, but I think it's also helpful to hear from others what some of the risk and important risk and protective factors are in their communities. But like I said, they're going to be different for different communities, and we want to be really mindful of that. Thank you, though. These are great. So the other really important factor that we want to consider is what is most changeable. So changeability refers to a community's capacity to influence a specific risk or protective factor. We don't want to be focusing our efforts on something that isn't really potentially changeable. So the ways that we determine a factor's changeability is by asking, do we have the resources and readiness to address this factor? Does a suitable program or practice exist to address this factor? And can we produce outcomes within a reasonable time frame? And I think it's important to note what is a reasonable time frame is also going to really differ community to community, and that's a pretty subjective question, but also I think an important one to consider. So I'm going to ask you the same question for the communities that you live in and serve. What would you say are the most changeable risk factors and the most changeable protective factors? And I'll leave this slide up so you have the criteria for reference. But if folks can go ahead and enter into the chat what you think are the most changeable risk and protective factors in the communities that you serve. Societal divides, housing and employment, integrated treatment of co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions, how we fund programs. I'm seeing a lot of mention of school and education, so access to education, increased psychoed in schools, housing, quality childcare, employment, funding. Yeah, so I think with funding, it'd be helpful to think about funding for what, right? What specifically do we want more funding for? These are awesome. Thank you all. So once again, I'm going to ask you all to make your individual lists as you continue to contribute to our communal list here. For your community, what would you say are the most changeable risk and protective factors? And, you know, I see here a lot of reference to the need for system level change, right? I'm not seeing people mention things at an individual level, right? We're seeing legislation to maintain mental health services, a lot of reference to funding, housing. This isn't talking about individuals making individual changes, because we understand that changeability in terms of risk and protective factors needs to happen at a much bigger level than the individual. Okay, so hopefully you all have your list of your most important factors and your most changeable factors. And that really brings us to this graphic that I like about the idea that prevention planning is most effective when we prioritize the risk and protective factors that are high on change and high on importance. So that's where we are going to be most effective in implementing change and preventing substance use disorder. Our next best option, if there's not a lot of overlap between what's high on importance and high on changeability, so like looking at your list, is there some overlap? If there's not, they say the next best option is to really prioritize factors that have high importance, meaning this is something that's really important, but low changeability. The reason for that is that we don't want to focus our efforts on something that isn't that important, and it's really typically easier to increase something's changeability than it is to increase its importance, right? If something is pretty changeable, but it's really not that important, it's not going to be the most effective in preventing substance use disorder developing within a community. We can, absent those options, we can also address a factor that does have low importance but high changeability, and this can give a community the sense of a quick win. This can be effective in raising awareness and support for the need for more prevention efforts, and it can also help increase the community's capacity to address more important factors down the road. So if you're seeing that you've got a lot of things that are high on changeability but not that important, it doesn't mean that it's not worth the effort to implement prevention strategies. But I think this is a helpful way to think about where can we best address and kind of point our efforts. So kind of putting these pieces together, looking at your list, what risk factors for your community are high in both importance and changeability, and what protective factors for your community are high in both importance and changeability. And when you have a moment, go ahead and enter those into the chat. Yeah. Health insurance, housing, education, substance misuse, food resources, education, housing and funding, support and education as a protective factor, attention to low-income neighborhoods. I like this high in both as accessible housing and rehab resources, transportation, absolutely. An opportunity to learn to handle challenges, very interesting. Protective factors, programs, lack of resources, broken families. Yeah, changing the mindset of the community to see substance use disorder as a health crisis. So again, the importance of community buy-in is so important, that we need community support to implement change, and communities aren't going to put their efforts behind prevention efforts if they don't see them as being important. Vaping, especially among youth. So I really appreciate you all putting some of these things all together. Housing first, absolutely. Because I think, risk and protective factors can seem a little oversimplified at first, but when we really think about how do we understand risk and protective factors for substance use disorder, and how do we then use that understanding to actually implement a prevention effort, and strategy. This is really complicated stuff. And so what I was saying is I think it can be deceptively simple, but it very clearly is pretty complicated and layered. So I like the way that this SAMHSA's guide kind of breaks some of these down. And if we think back to some of the risk and protective factors that we discussed at the start of the training, like when you think about the risk factors that have contributed to people's harmful relationships with drugs, there's no shortage of really important factors, right? Home environment, education, housing, neighborhood. And it can be daunting to think about whether these things are changeable. And so what I especially like about the changeability questions is that whether something will change quickly isn't the most important feature. So taking housing as an example, because it's something that so many of you have mentioned as being a really key factor, is that, a question is, do we have the tools to change this eventually? And several of you have named housing first, which is a strategy that we have, that is available, that we know can be really effective. And so we want to think about changeability in terms of what the bigger systemic problems are that have potential solutions that actually work to fix it. And so in terms of housing, I would say like housing first kind of meets that criteria. It doesn't mean that it's going to be an overnight solution, because these aren't overnight problems, but it's a really good like upstream solution. And so again, we want to think about what ideas and practices would result in change if given the right resources and support. And I hear, comments here about like stigma or changeability can be accomplished in stages, but sometimes it isn't addressed immediately. And so that is that balance between working with the person who is in front of us and then also simultaneously working on these like bigger picture issues. And, as I mentioned, I think that's where we need that partnership between direct service providers and policymakers and administrators. So I see here that Carlos is saying, as a pastor and registered nurse, I have the advantage to understand better the importance of learning about protective factors and other similar topics to address social determinants of health. Any experiences educating this topic or similar topics to faith community leaders or pastors? I believe faith communities trained on MI, trauma-informed care, mental health first aid will be more effective in serving their communities, and in particular mental illness, addiction, and recovery, because stigma is huge. Carlos, I would say thank you so much for your comment. I absolutely agree with you that faith communities, as well as I would argue most communities, would be better positioned to effectively serve their communities with support and training on those topics. And I'm curious to hear if there's, other people, other attendees who know of any resources or experiences of education on these topics. I'm really appreciative of all of you doing so much amazing resource sharing and brainstorming together. I'll give folks another minute to enter any other comments as we wrap up, kind of bringing these pieces together. But I think, this was a brief conversation kind of going through this, but I think these are things that you could have additional conversations about with your teams, with your programs, and Narcan availability and training is huge. It's something I'm a big proponent of. But I wanted to back up just a little bit to address the comments about change not being addressed immediately. I think that's where we really maybe need to focus then on capacity, is raising community awareness, really strengthening a prevention team and engaging community stakeholders. We want to partner with people in the community to, focus on this last guiding principle of sustainability, and think about where are we hoping to go and where can we best target our efforts to be effective in getting there. And I see some resources, FACT program and wraparound services help with planning. I'm not familiar with that, so if Tanisha is able to share a little bit more about that, I'm guessing or hoping that I'm not the only one who's not familiar, but curious about that. And yeah, absolutely. Access to appropriate grants for our programs is really crucial. We need to keep our doors open. So I think hopefully you all are seeing some of the ways that these pieces come together and really fit together in a quite complicated but really beautiful way to hopefully affect change. So step 3 here, we talked about strategic planning, and I think this is sort of the meat of this and the really complicated part of, so if we have a sense of what the problem is and we have tried to build awareness and community buy-in, like how do we decide what to do? So that's like the multi-million-dollar question. Once we do it, then we work on implementation. So step 4 is where a community's prevention plan is put into action. And ideally, we do that by delivering evidence-based programs and practices. So we balance fidelity and adaptation and establish critical implementation support. So a little bit about what that means in terms of balancing fidelity and adaptation. So fidelity is the degree to which a program or practice is implemented as intended, fidelity to the model. But then there's adaptation, which refers to how much and in what ways a program or practice is changed to meet the local circumstances. And I think that's something that all of us encounter, even if we're not prevention planners, when we're using a lot of different implementation techniques. Is how do we stay true to the model, but also adapt based on what's unfolding in real time. So that is a key part of the implementation. And one of the things that the SAMHSA's Strategic Prevention Framework Guide offers is some guidelines around how to manage that balance. So things like retaining the core components. So even if we have to make some adaptations, what are the core features and how much are we staying true to the model? So those are kind of like the key ingredients. Another piece they mention is building capacity before we change a program. So we want to, rather than changing a program to fit local conditions, we really want to think about how to develop resources or build local readiness so that this program can be delivered more as it was originally designed. So this is kind of the idea of adding something rather than subtracting. So instead of subtracting pieces of fidelity to the model, adding ways to get the local community or program ready for the model. Great question from Shirley. How do we do the strategic prevention planning and implementation if they don't have adequate funding to do it? So I'm glad you asked that for a couple of reasons. One is that we need people who are, making voices heard to say that this is important. If we want to address substance use in our communities and our societies, we absolutely need to offer appropriate treatment But we also need to think about prevention. We're not going to address substance use treatment or substance use disorders by only working with people who have a problem. We want to be preventative, and I think we see a real shift in that happening in terms of our health care. And as someone mentioned earlier, I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a shift in how we think about prevention in terms of our mental health care. And I don't know how much as communities and as a society we think about that the importance of prevention in the realm of substance use treatment and substance use disorders. So we need to have, build capacity for this funding and to make clear the importance of it. And so to kind of tie these pieces together, I think that's where the evaluation and assessment comes into play, to think about, this is where we look at how's it going, what's worked well, what kind of improvements or changes do we need to make, and to share the results. And then ideally this process kind of continues from there. And I think the more we're able to be strategic in our prevention planning and implementation, the more we're able to then show the effectiveness of it and that this really matters and can make a difference. And it builds from there. But I hear you, Shirley, that I think this is the challenge that many providers and folks who appreciate and want to focus on prevention find themselves in is, we need funding to do this really important work. So as we wrap up, I'm going to ask folks to take a couple moments, and if you want to share your answers in the chat or just take a moment to reflect on your own. I like to do this at the end of a training because, you all have taken a good chunk out of your day to spend this time here with me, and I appreciate it, but this is, 2 hours is very small in terms of making the kind of changes that I'm really happy to hear are on your minds. And so how do we continue this conversation and this line of thinking beyond the time here today? And so I'm curious, what are things that you feel like you're already doing well that you want to continue? If you could take away, what's the one most important thing you learned today? We're here in January. If you think about in June and you're like, oh yeah, I went to that webinar in January. If there's one thing you want to make sure that you remember from today, what would that be? I think we're more likely to remember that if we take a moment to kind of etch that into our minds. And then moving forward, what is one specific change that you want to make? Again, it can be really overwhelming to think about all these pieces together, but what is one specific thing that you want to make a commitment to doing differently as you move forward and that you can start right now? Not something that we need, additional funding or changes, but something that's in your control that you want to do right away. So I appreciate seeing all these responses. I think it's helpful for you all to sort of set an intention, but it's really exciting for me to see all the things that you're taking away and that you want to be doing moving forward. So I think ACEs took a big piece. No community can address all the factors at once. Being deliberate and strategic. These are really great. Thank you all so much. So I want to leave a little time for question and answer. And as you all continue to enter these incredible responses into here, I want to go through, here's again my contact information if you're interested. But here's a reference and resources. So we have a lot of information here about the ACEs. All of the links that you see on this page are hyperlinked on the individual slides. So if there's a specific slide that you are like, oh, I would like to learn more about that, these are the hyperlinks that are available. This one here, the FADAA, this is actually the original ACE study. So it was done back in the 90s. And I was really excited to find the full text version of it. And it's worth looking through and being able to see, you know, what they found. And they have some really great graphics in the study that shows their results. So it's something, if you're interested in the ACEs, I think it's good I love this video that I think is a good summary, but again, if it's something you're interested in, I think it's always worth reading the original study. And then this one here on top is this guide that we've kind of been working through for a whole time. And then this bottom resource here is the Trauma-Informed Care and Behavioral Health Services. It's their TIP, treatment improvement protocol. That again, I can't recommend highly enough. I reference it quite a bit in my day-to-day work. So a couple other resources for you all to check out if you're interested. So thank you so much for your time and attention today and your thoughtful comments and for the work that you do every day. It's been a rough couple of years for treatment providers, and I'm appreciative of what you all do. I know that no matter what your role is, you don't get enough acknowledgement, and thank you for the work that you do. So I also want to end by just thanking each of you for the work that you do every day. And so with that, we have some additional time for any questions that may have come up. Rebecca, are there any questions?
Yes, there are. So we had someone ask, can you give some examples of how Chicago, as a community, has used some of these prevention approaches, how they've implemented them?
Yeah, so it's complicated. I would say some of the things that I think Chicago is doing really well is, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I think one of the things that Chicago is doing well is being able to really partner with communities, and certainly to varying degrees. You know, Chicago is a very big city, so it's a lot of different neighborhoods, but I'm seeing a lot more really locally community-driven efforts. So things like opening a harm reduction-based substance use treatment program on the west side of Chicago. And that's a program that I worked in. We partnered with the Chicago Recovery Alliance, which is an outreach program that has a syringe exchange program that also does a lot of testing for things like HIV and Hep C, TB, as well as a lot of community education. So they offer really specific and detailed harm reduction strategies, which I think is a great way of really meeting the community where they are, as well as offering a lot of resources and services. But more and more I hear from people in programs that the Chicago Recovery Alliance is an organization that they really trust and feel comfortable accessing. So again, thinking about like the changeability. In terms of housing, it's always a work in progress, but I think I know I hear more now about housing first and organizations that have a more robust understanding and practice of harm reduction than I did 10 years ago. So there's always some tension whenever there's efforts to drive change, and certainly Chicago is no different, where there's some pushback from other community stakeholders. But I think those are some of the things that I have seen that I think are making a difference.
And then we had another question about if you could give some networks, or if there's any listed in your resources for bridging community resources for residents returning to their community.
So that one's a little tough. I'm actually going to open that up to the audience. If anyone else has anything local, my expertise on resources is more Chicago-based, but if other folks know of any Florida-based resources for supporting people returning home, I'm guessing that might be either from incarceration or from treatment. I really appreciate that question because that is such a vulnerable time for folks. And we know, thinking about risk and protective factors for overdose, that's a really risky time period. So if anyone is able to share resources in the chat, I think that's a great question and would love to see if folks know of any Florida-based support.
Great. Well, I see some coming in through the chat now. So if you want to read those, Susie, I'll let you, and then I'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar.
Great. Yeah, I see a great resources family. Absolutely. In Jacksonville, there's a JREC program. Tampa Bay has a program that works with reentry called Metropolitan Ministries, 12-step programs and mutual support. I see Disc Village. So thank you. Those are some great resources, and you all have done an amazing job of resource sharing throughout our time today. So I also want to just acknowledge and thank you all for that. And so Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you to wrap things up.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar today. We have included Susie's contact information so that you may contact her with any further questions. And then, Susie, we would just really thank you for putting on this webinar. You always give such great information. We really appreciate it. Please see the chat panel for a link to today's survey. Additionally, when I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADAA's website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license, prefix, and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You will need to use the same email address you used when registering for today's webinar through WebEx when you set up your profile in FADAA's system. This helps connect your attendance to your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. The sender will be messenger@webex.com. Evaluations will close midnight, Monday, January 31st, 2022. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile 30 business days after the event. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day.